Hello and welcome to my video on risk identification. My name is Aaron Hughes and I've been working in enterprise risk management for about 6 years now across the public and private sector. So in this video, I'm going to do a bit of a recap in terms of what the risk management process is. So this is the first stage of that process. I'll be talking about what risk identification actually is itself, why it's important to identify our risks, where to start. So if we have a blank sheet of paper, what can we do to essentially kick off the process of risk identification? And then I'll be going over some examples of some ways that we could identify risks, some tools and techniques that are quite useful across different organizations. So this is a diagram of our risk management process. So there's 5 different stages to this, and the first one being our risk identification. So we'll be jumping into this in a bit more detail. So we identify our risks here. Stage 2 is our analysis. So this is when we look at the nature and the sources, the consequences. So what causes risk? What are the consequences of risks? Evaluation. This is essentially comparing your risk criteria. So we're almost scoring our risks against criteria and against risk appetite. Our risk response. This is essentially how we're going to respond to the risk. Are we going to mitigate it or not? And then stage 5, this is our monitoring and reporting for our risk. Just a quick recap. So I've gone into a bit more detail of this on a previous presentation. So make sure you watch all these videos in order. So what is risk identification? So it's essentially the systematic process of recognizing and documenting potential threats and opportunities, because risks can be good things and bad things, that could impact an organization's ability to achieve its objectives. So we're always looking at risks in terms of our objectives when it comes to enterprise risk management. And just like our radar in the middle, we use our risk identification to essentially scan the environment internally, externally, to see what the potential threats are and what the potential opportunities are. And through this scanning of our environment, we can essentially choose which one of these threats or opportunities we want to closely monitor and potentially mitigate some of them. But emphasis on the systematic process, because we want to make sure we do these things thoroughly, part of this enterprise wide approach for risk management. So, why is it important to identify risks? So, the earlier you identify a potential problem, the easier it is to fix. I'm sure you can think of lots of situations in your everyday life where this kind of principle applies to, but especially when it comes to things like your cars. If you hear some sort of ticking noise or rattling, it's probably best to get it to to a mechanic who can essentially scan the car for potential problems or risks or whatever it is to fix them. And I guess one of the benefits of identifying our risks is essentially if we can catch them before they materialize, it gives us more time to plan. So rather than constantly fighting fires, you're essentially putting yourself on the front foot and giving yourself more time to think about how would we respond to that risk if it was to occur. It gives us kind of more efficiency when it comes to allocating our resources. So because we have extra time, we can potentially put together a budget or a plan so we can spend money a bit more efficiently and effectively, use people's time. So everything to do with cost and things like that. It's a lot more efficient to kind of plan ahead for our risks. One of the most important things I'd say from my perspective is the fact that you yourself and your organization and your teams can agree an approach and a stance when it comes to different risks. So it might actually be that you're comfortable with some different types of risks, or if a particular risk happens, you're all familiar with how you would respond to it. So there's a bit more coordination across your organization, and things like that actually give you more confidence across your organization, whether that's amongst your teams, stakeholders, key decision makers, investors. And I guess it gives the confidence to kind of make better decisions when it comes to your risk management, because you have that evidence in your back pocket. If you're thinking about whether you want to turn left or whether you want to turn right, you've kind of peeked your head round and you've gone, right, I know what's around the corner for each of these. I'm more confident when I will walk around the corner because I'm equipped and we've had a bit more time to plan for each of those. And because of this, it kind of helps your organization become a bit more resilient. It kind of helps you develop more of a resilient strategy for your organization. And this is particularly true for things like business cases. I guess it's standard practice now to identify risks in business cases. But overall, it will make your organization more resilient. There's going to be less surprises I think that's massive for key decision makers and senior people in organizations. They don't want surprises. They want to know what's going on. They want the elephants in the room all identified. And I guess having these sessions where you can identify risk gives people the opportunity to essentially share what's keeping them awake at night and actually identify what the elephants are in the room. So, if you have a blank sheet of paper or you want to identify some additional risks, you can ask the question, what keeps you awake at night? And the reason why this question is quite helpful is because it essentially focuses the mind and it really makes you think about what are the key pertinent risks that are kind of could impact your organization. Um, so this makes sure that you're not writing down every single thing that could go wrong. You make sure you're just writing down the key things that could impact your objectives. And there are three kind of elements or kind of ways that you can look at identifying your risks. I've got the first one here, which is using your organizational objectives. And this could be your overall objectives, could be your vision, your mission. It could be your departmental objectives, team objectives. It could be the objectives in a business case. So essentially what you would do here is you would write out your objectives potentially on a whiteboard or on a flip chart, and you would then come up with risks to non-achievement of those objectives, and it keeps your risk relevant. It makes sure that you're not thinking about things that potentially you're not trying to aim to achieve, and this is always a good place to start, and that's why I've put a gold star for this one, because actually this is probably the one we use the most, and it focuses the mind, keeps people talking about the right things for your risk of identification. The second one here is stakeholder expectations. So, obviously, as an organization, you're going to have lots of expectations on you, whether that's internal expectations, external expectations. So, it could be from staff, it could be from customers, suppliers, industry partners, it could be particular legal regulation, legislation, whatever it might be. And this is often another good way to help you identify some different types of risks that potentially just looking at your objectives might not actually uncover. So helpful to maybe do some of these together. The other one here is looking at your core processes or key dependencies. This is often quite a useful one because you can break things down by particular functions in an organization and then come up with certain risks to those functions or key dependencies not actually occurring or functioning as they should do. And this could be internal ones, external ones, things like single points of failure, and often thinking about your processes, and you'll start to understand just how interconnected a lot of your risks are. And actually, some of the risks from core processes probably will come out in some of your objectives as well. So, if you're struggling for suggestions or ideas, just using objectives, I'd say use some of these other ones as well to help stimulate some discussion in your risk of identification sessions. So, some tools and techniques for identifying your risks. So, the first one here is a very classic one in an office environment. So, this would be your brainstorming. So, this would be where you get different minds into the room, potentially from different teams. Some cross collaboration is often quite good in brainstorming. This would be essentially where you'd have a pin board, a whiteboard, a flip chart, whatever it might be. And essentially, there is no right or wrong answer. It's essentially a creative session where everybody can just throw ideas out there and there isn't a bad idea. So you would essentially start off by throwing any idea or any risk that somebody might think of, you put them all down, then over time through the session you might filter some of the less relevant ones out and focus a bit more on the ones that everybody agrees on, and more relevant ones to your objectives of the session. So brainstorming is often quite a good way of identifying risks. Sometimes there might be risks that you may not carry on with, but you might just want to keep them in the back of your mind because they could be useful further down the line. But one piece of advice for brainstorming would be, the content of the session is important, but it's almost just as important to make sure you get the right people in the room, to make sure that you're going to get the right ideas and a good spread of opinions, because quite often people won't agree and it's good to get different perspectives. But another thing to think about is the level of seniority in the room. So just be mindful that if you've got some particularly high level managers or directors, there may be different conversations in the room, or some people may not feel comfortable to be open and honest in front of different levels or different teams. So just bear that in mind in terms of your participants. The next one is checklist and prompts. So this is often quite good when it comes to things like business cases or standard processes that you might have. Sometimes it's helpful not to start with a blank sheet of paper. Sometimes it could be helpful to have some particular questions that people might need to answer. And through this, you can identify risks. The prompts could be things like potential template risks that you might have used in the past. So this is often quite helpful and a good way to kind of learn from potential lessons that we'll speak about in a few slides time. But it's good sometimes not to start off a blank sheet of paper, particularly if you're stuck on time or some of these activities you do are repeated and they're not too different in between. Horizon scanning. So this is a really helpful one, particularly for organizations who want to think about their long-term resilience. So horizon scanning is essentially thinking about risks off into the future. So this could be risks that might affect you in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years time, and really, really far out. But it's important to do this. And the analogy I essentially use for this is if your organization is like an oil tanker, particularly if your organization's slow to change or they're quite you find change quite difficult. If you think about your organization as an oil tanker and you're scanning the horizon for these icebergs, if you essentially identify an iceberg right the way off into the future, it'll only take a slight change in the course of your direction to actually avoid that big iceberg or that catastrophe in the future. Minimal resources, minimal stress, minimal effort. It's almost the same in an organization. When you horizon scan, you can think about things far off into the future and you can slowly change your course or your plans or your strategy to avoid those types of risks. As opposed to being a big oil tanker and there being a big iceberg not too far away. And it's going to be very difficult to maneuver the ship to avoid the catastrophe, the risk, whatever it is, the issue. So often it's helpful to horizon scan just to at least be aware of what's on the horizon for your organization. This wouldn't be something you would do all the time because quite often these risks are slow to move and slow to change. A lot of organizations I've worked with probably do this once a year, but depending on the industry or the type of organization you are, you may want to do it slightly more or slightly less. It depends on the types of risks that your organization has and how often or how much they move. So, in a project and program environment, it might be you do it a bit more. But in terms of, say, corporate strategic risk, it might be that you do it annually or a little bit less, but often quite a helpful session to have. The next one is external publication. So it's often good to just to also look outside of your organization, look over the fence, look over in the other ponds. There are lots of different reports, whether that's from the World Economic Forum, so this one here, whether it's from your country's risk register. So this is often looking at some of the external risks to maybe your organization, or different institutions that also produce things like risk reports. This is the Institute of Risk Management, and they produce risk reports too. But there could be other different professional bodies who are more relevant to your organization, and they might produce some material that's helpful for you to identify and maybe even horizon scan some potential risks into the future. So often it's helpful just to keep tabs of what's going on because things that are happening on the outside potentially could also impact you in your organization. Networks and forums, this is often really good to help learn from different organizations. If there are particular networks or industry forums you can take part in, it's often good to get involved. Often risks will be spoken about, whether or not they call them risks or not is a different story. But actually, quite often you can learn about how different organizations are approaching and mitigating different risks. And you can often learn from the mistakes of others so you don't have to make them yourself. Or you can share your own information and help other organizations. But often a very, very good idea to get involved with relevant networks and forums. Lessons learned. So I mentioned this before. Often we don't want to repeat the mistakes that we have in the past, or we can learn from the mistakes of other people or other organizations. Quite often helpful to log the things that don't go very well in an organization. This is standard practice in a lot of program and project management methodologies. So you'd essentially say what worked well, what didn't work well. So when it comes to doing something similar again, you can review those lessons and make sure that you avoid those mistakes again, potentially looking at some of the issues or risks that they were looking at, and they might be good prompts actually for you to then include them in your own risk register, or at least consider them and discuss them. Surveys, so this is another helpful way. It depends on the organization and whether it's appropriate or not to actually do these, but it could actually be that you ask some questions to your organization. You can ask them for their views or opinions on particular issues or topics, whether this is an internal survey to staff or it could be an external survey to suppliers or customers, whoever it might be. Quite often, a helpful way to get information, but you do have to be careful in terms of how you run these surveys, how many questions you ask, whether you're collecting qualitative or quantitative data, and how difficult the analysis might be, and also how trustworthy the information is that you get back. But nevertheless, always a good way to collect information in a formalized way. Sometimes people run surveys and then do follow up interviews, but nevertheless, a helpful way to help identify risks in an organization. So thank you very much for watching this video. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section. Or if you want to send me a direct message, feel free to also do that. But other than that, make sure you like and share this video and make sure you leave a comment. So thank you very much for watching.